Now, as authors of historical lesbian literature, both Marianne and I are interested in looking at not just the history of lesbian literature, but also looking at what world events shape these stories, and also to what extent these stories are reflections of the particular authors' lives as they looked for affirmation and their place in the world. Now, something that I hope will become clear over the course of this presentation is that Western lesbian literature parallels the social experience of lesbians and lesbianism. We see lesbian literature going from clandestine in the first part of the century to classical in the 1950s and 60s to consciousness raising in the late 1960s and 70s. We see this trend continuing through the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, where suddenly we have a significant change not only in the content of the literature available, but also in the variety. We begin to see genres emerging within the, or subgenres emerging within the genre. Now, I mention this for two reasons. First of all, because, well, it's true. And secondly, because in preparing this presentation, it became very clear that as lesbians have become more accepted in society, arguably, the number, variety, and the scope of lesbian literature has also become more plentiful and diverse. Now, that's great if you're a reader. That's fabulous if you're a reader. If you're trying to put together a concise yet insightful presentation for UMKC, it's bad, because there is just so much that you can choose from. So how does one choose? With all of the literature that's available, how do you choose what actually defines a particular era? And long story short, what I decided to do was break this discussion into decades and talk about the events that helped inform each decade, and then focus on one or two key novels that illustrate the lesbian social climate and have impacted the history of our literature. Having said that, for anybody who really wants to have a long, excruciating detail about lesbian literature after, come find me. I'm your girl. So one thing that I hope that you will find in common with the books that I'm going to be introducing is the fact that the authors are, through their characters, oftentimes searching and questioning where they fit into society at large. And oftentimes you'll see that the characters and the storylines are reflections of the author's own lives as they look for affirmation in a world that was constantly changing. Now, there we go. Up until the end of the 19th century, the accepted cultural norms were that women, all women, belonged in the home. And during this period of time, the expectation was that their responsibilities were what we consider traditional: cooking, cleaning, taking care of the children, and providing a welcoming home for the men in their lives. But in 1890, something happened that changed that for many women, particularly those who were living in the larger cities, and that was the Progressive Era. Now, the Progressive Era was a 40-year span that was characterized by social activism and political reform in the United States. Now, I want to be clear. When I talk about the Progressive Era, it wasn't about women's rights, at least not initially. It was about social reform. It was about exposing corruption and getting rid of the inefficiencies, the waste, the injustices of the Gilded Age. And we can see this reform in a number of arenas, with the most famous, of course, being prohibition. Later, we see it also in the suffrage movement. Now, both of these issues were key, because what they did is they allowed for women to help exact social change. And for the first time for them to step onto the public stage and have a voice. First for these issues, but then much later for themselves. And by banding together, through their activism, women were able to carve out previously unavailable freedoms that included in 1920, of course, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave women the right to vote. So we start out less permissive. And by the 1920s, we see a society that has become more permissive. And the 1920s were pivotal for women. Married white women, and I stress that these are white women. There was a very, very different experience for women of color. Began to get more education, and subsequently were having not just families, but also jobs. And single white women, too, were afforded a lot of freedoms. Suddenly, they were able to live on their own, they were able to get jobs, they were able to date around. And the most extreme of these women were, of course, the flappers. These bold, audacious women who challenged old ways of thinking and behaving and demanded, for the first time, the same liberties and freedoms as men. Now, it should come as absolutely no surprise that with these new paradigms and these new perspectives on sexual freedom, you get a change in how women approach life. Now, because single women were becoming more self-reliant, because they no longer needed to marry for financial stability, they were able to make their own money. And that opened the door for different relationships, particularly with straight women, different relationships with men. Because suddenly they didn't need them to be based on the men taking care of them. The relationships became much more casual. So again, this clearly applies to straight women, but what about lesbians? Well, for lesbians, the 1920s and these changes in the cultural paradigm actually meant that they had a little bit more cover, a little bit more freedom. Now, all around the U.S. during this time, more and more girls were shaking off these expectations of marriage and family, and they were going to the big cities where they were getting jobs. Now, granted, they were traditional jobs, jobs such as shopkeepers and nurses and teachers and librarians. Now again, I should be clear that most of the women that were doing this were heterosexual. But the changes in society that afforded these women generally this independence also allowed for lesbians to have a certain amount of freedom to live more openly. Now, because of this type of quote-unquote independent behavior was becoming more accepted, women who identified as lesbians were much less likely to be questioned about their choices to have jobs, to have female roommates, to live in female-centric spaces. Now, I say this with a caveat, because when we talk about early lesbianism, there's not really all of that much information that we have at our disposal. There's a lot less documentation with lesbianism than we have with male homosexuality. And there are likely several reasons for this. First of all, most of the researchers were men. Secondly, the argument could be made that lesbianism was much less obvious to people around, and as such, attracted less attention. If you think about it for a second, it was, and still is, much more culturally acceptable for women to be publicly demonstrative, to be affectionate, to greet each other with kisses, to walk arm in arm. People don't look at that askance with women, but they do with men. And because these shows of female affection were considered more natural, lesbianism was much less persecuted because it wasn't considered as offensive. But here's something that's also interesting. In terms of legal prosecution, most of the laws which were made by men and were targeted to homosexual men were concerned with the act of penetration, something that you could actually apparently prove. And so you have these variables, but then the other thing that you have is that women tended to be much less out. They tended to be a lot more under the radar. In fact, and this is where I start talking about lesbian literature, we really don't see that much in terms of depictions of lesbianism in the general public until the 1928 publication in the United Kingdom of a novel by Radcliffe Hall titled The Well of Loneliness. Now, The Well of Loneliness is a story of, well, first of all, how many people have read Well of Loneliness? Excellent. All right. Well, for those of you who haven't, the story is of a protagonist named Stephen Gordon, who is a woman, and who, like the author, struggled to identify her sexuality and to live her life dressed in men's clothing, pursuing male exclusive activities, and loving women. Now, Well of Loneliness contained no explicit language, no sexual references. In fact, the only line that suggests a sexual act is the line, "And that night they were not divided." Yet, because of the subject matter, the book was seized and banned under the Obscene Publications Act of 1857 and remained that way until 1959. Ironically, though, one of the most widely read lesbian-themed books in history was banned for the first part of its publication.